The forest was waking with a cold morning mist that clung low to the ground, drifting around her boots as she moved with slow, deliberate steps through the tangled pathway between the towering trees, and the cubs trailed behind her in hesitant zigzag patterns, unsure of their place in this strange morning world, yet strangely comforted by her steady presence and the quiet warmth that seemed to settle around her like a soft, invisible cloak. She had found them only an hour earlier, huddled beneath a fallen log, their tiny bodies trembling from fear and exhaustion, and although she had approached with caution, the cubs had lifted their heads at the sound of her gentle hum, and something in that moment had stirred a flicker of trust between them, a fragile thread that now pulled them forward behind her. The morning light filtered through the branches in thin, shifting beams, painting patches of gold across the forest floor, and every time a beam caught the cub's fur, their small shapes shimmered like moving sparks, but even the light could not erase the uncertainty in their steps. For every crackle of leaves, every whisper of wind seemed to remind them of the night they had endured. Alone, she glanced back only briefly, making sure they were close enough to hear her voice if danger rose again, because she knew the forest was alive in ways most people never understood, and she needed the cubs to sense her confidence even if her own nerves hummed beneath the surface. She breathed in the scent of damp earth and pine, letting it fill her lungs and steady her mind, and she slowed her stride, intentionally allowing the cubs time to adjust to her pace, time to understand she would not abandon them, time to simply exist beside the presence that did not threaten. Step by careful step, she guided them past roots that arched like old bones and around thickets that rustled with unseen creatures, and each time one of the cubs stumbled, she paused without turning, allowing her stillness to reassure them so they could scamper forward and regain their place near her heels. Though the forest stretched wide and unpredictable, she moved with the quiet certainty of someone who refused to leave the vulnerable behind, and the cubs, drawn to that strength, continued to drift ever closer, as if their tiny hearts were slowly stitching themselves to hers. With each passing moment, she whispered, "Stay close," and the sound slipped into the mist like a warm thread weaving through the cold morning air, reaching the cubs with a softness that steadied their trembling nerves, and the cubs lifted their heads as if the simple shape of her voice was more trustworthy than anything the forest could offer. They edged closer, forming a loose cluster around her legs, their small bodies brushing against her boots as though contact itself could anchor them to safety, and she slowed her breath, letting the calm in her chest spill outward, for she knew the cubs would mirror whatever emotion she carried, and fear was a luxury. She refused to let them inherit the forest around them, murmured with waking sounds, the creak of branches, the distant splash of a stream, the soft flutter of wings overhead, yet none of it seemed to pull the cubs' attention away from her, because they had already begun to understand that as long as she moved forward, they would move forward too. She crouched slightly, lowering herself just enough that her presence felt closer to their world, and the cubs responded by arranging themselves with surprising precision, stepping into a shape that resembled order, even though none of them had ever known such guidance before, and she felt a swell of quiet awe rise within her. At the sight, her voice remained low and steady as she repeated, "Stay close," letting the phrase become a rhythm in the air, a steady pulse that wrapped around the cubs like a protective veil, and with each repetition, their steps grew more confident, their movements less frantic, as though her words were teaching their hearts to beat in unison. They continued forward together, her path becoming their path, her pace becoming their pace, and though the forest still held shadows thick enough to swallow sound, the cubs walked with a new purpose, their trust unfolding one careful step at a time as they followed the human who had given them a reason to believe in safety. Again the forest seemed to hold its breath as she moved, and the cubs followed in a loose line, each step carefully measured, as if they were learning an unspoken language of trust and rhythm from her presence alone. Distant rustle of leaves made the cubs pause briefly, but she did not falter. Instead, she adjusted her pace ever so slightly, letting her calm carry them past the sudden disturbance, and they mirrored her without hesitation, their tiny bodies shifting in unison behind her, as though some invisible thread had tied them to her movements. Sunlight dappled the ground through the canopy above and caught the cubs' fur in flashes of gold, brown, and black, making them look almost unreal as they navigated the uneven path. Yet even the beauty of the morning could not distract them from the quiet authority she exuded with every step. She glanced back once, her eyes soft but alert, checking that none of the cubs lagged behind, and in that moment she saw how fully they had begun to rely on her, how their small eyes followed her without question, and she realized that something rare and delicate was forming, a bond neither spoken nor forced but grown out of patience and gentle command. The path narrowed between gnarled roots and low-hanging branches, forcing them to move single file, and the cubs instinctively fell into line behind her, their tiny paws falling into a silent rhythm as she led the way like a guide through a world that could have swallowed them whole if they were alone. Step by careful step she carried them forward, her own heartbeat steady and measured, and the cubs echoed it without knowing that this simple act of following was their first lesson in courage and trust. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, making the branches sway and the leaves rustle with a low whisper that could have startled anyone else, but the cubs did not break their line. They pressed closer to her heels, sensing her unshaken calm and letting it anchor them as they moved. The forest floor was uneven with hidden dips and tangled roots, yet she stepped carefully, scanning every inch ahead. As the cubs followed blindly but with growing confidence, their small paws landing where hers had shown the way, almost like soldiers learning formation from a commander. They could barely understand but instinctively trusted. She kept her voice low, murmuring, "Stay close," again and again, letting it fall through the morning air like a soft chant that carried reassurance more than instruction, and the cubs responded without hesitation, tightening their line and stepping in time with her movement, their eyes flicking between the path ahead and the figure that led them. Every now and then a bird would flutter overhead, sending a ripple of excitement through the cubs, but she did not react. And slowly they too learned to ignore the distractions, holding their focus solely on the rhythm of her steps and the quiet command of her presence. As they moved deeper, the light shifted in strange patterns, creating pools of shadow that seemed to move like living things around them, and yet the cubs remained in perfect alignment, their tiny forms a procession that mirrored her calm, steady energy, and she felt a strange pride knowing that in this moment they were trusting her completely. The line stretched behind her, small and disciplined, and every step forward was a testament to patience and quiet guidance, a dance of instinct and trust that bound them together, without a single word beyond the gentle repeated whisper, "Stay close." Every step she took was measured, careful and deliberate, aware that the cubs were learning, not just to follow, but to trust, and the forest seemed to hum around them, alive with hidden sounds and movements that might have sent them scattering. If they were alone, she moved slowly over roots that twisted like old veins beneath the soil and around low-hanging branches that brushed against her shoulders, letting the cubs adjust to each obstacle at their own pace, and with each careful motion, they mirrored her steps, forming a steady rhythm that felt almost ceremonial in its precision. A sudden rustle came from the underbrush, and the cubs stiffened, their small bodies tense and alert, their ears twitching at every subtle sound in the forest around them. But she did not falter. She slowed her pace just enough to let her calm settle over them like a warm blanket, and whispered, "Stay close," letting the words thread through the tension and reach them. The cubs pressed closer to her heels, forming a tighter line, their tiny paws sinking into the damp earth with cautious but steady steps, and each time one of them hesitated, she gave a small nod or shifted her weight, just enough for them to understand that forward meant safety, and that fear could be held at bay when they moved together. Sunlight flickered through the canopy above, casting dancing shadows across their path, and the cubs moved through the shifting patterns as if guided by some instinct that mirrored her own movements, their eyes tracking her every step as though the rhythm of her stride was the rhythm of the world itself. She kept her voice low, steady and soft, repeating, "Stay close," over and over, letting it become a mantra in the misty morning air, and with each repetition the cubs grew bolder, stepping with less hesitation and moving with more confidence, as though the very act of listening to her words gave them courage. They had not known they possessed. The path curved around a fallen tree, and the cubs slipped behind her without breaking formation, their small bodies following the arc of her movement, almost as if they had memorized the lines of her steps and would not stray from them no matter what. Shadows lurked in the forest around them. Step by step they advanced together through the uncertain forest, their trust in her growing stronger with each moment, their tiny line a living testament to the quiet power of patience and the gentle authority of a human who had earned their unwavering attention. The wildlife rangers watched from a distance, amazed at the sight unfolding before them, the cubs moving in perfect alignment behind her, as if they had been trained in secret formations that no human had ever designed, and yet there was nothing forced in their steps, only a quiet obedience born of trust. She continued forward, her pace steady and deliberate, her eyes scanning the path ahead for any hidden dangers, and the cubs mirrored Her movements, each small paw landing where hers had fallen, as though guided by an invisible hand that linked them to her in ways deeper than sight or sound. Every so often a leaf would fall or a bird would flutter past, sending a ripple of excitement through the cubs, but they did not scatter. They stayed in line, following her silently, their tiny bodies moving as one cohesive unit, and the rangers noted how rare it was to see such disciplined behavior emerge naturally in the wild. She whispered, "Stay close," again, letting the familiar phrase anchor them in the midst of uncertainty, and with each repetition the cubs tightened their formation, their small eyes flicking between her and the path ahead, learning without words that their safety depended on movement together and on the calm, steady presence of the human who led them. As they approached a narrow clearing, the cubs adjusted instinctively, keeping the line straight and compact, their paws slipping over moss and soil without breaking rhythm, and she felt a quiet pride swell within her, knowing that they had begun to understand the power of trust, the lesson of following without fear, and the bond that was forming step by step as they moved forward together. The rescue station came into view through the dense trees, and the cubs did not break formation, their tiny bodies aligned perfectly behind her, as though they understood that the end of this journey was near, yet that they must remain disciplined until the very last step. She could feel the tension in the air shift, the cubs moving with a mixture of excitement and caution, their small paws quickening slightly but never faltering, and she whispered, "Stay close," letting the words fall through the morning air like a steady anchor to calm their racing hearts. The forest around them seemed to notice the change in pace, the birds quieted, and even the rustling leaves softened, as if giving space for the small procession to reach safety unchallenged, and the cubs responded immediately, holding their positions close to her heels, watching her every motion with complete trust. Every step forward was deliberate and measured as she guided them over the last stretch of uneven ground, past thick roots and low-hanging branches, the cubs moving with remarkable coordination, each tiny paw landing in the space she had shown them, and the patrol team caught their breath, witnessing a scene that seemed more like a practiced ritual than a chance survival. She glanced back briefly, her eyes meeting theirs, and she saw the reflection of her own calm mirrored in their small faces, their trust complete and unwavering. And in that moment, the cubs were no longer simply following, they were united with her in purpose, in rhythm, in silent understanding that they would not be left behind. As the station drew near, the cubs maintained their perfect line, their steps synchronized, their tiny bodies a testament to patience, guidance, and the quiet authority she carried. And she knew that when they finally reached safety, the bond formed in these woods would endure beyond this single journey, a fragile, unspoken loyalty born from trust, courage, and care. She finally reached the entrance of the rescue station, and the cubs gathered around her, forming a small protective circle, their tiny bodies pressing close as if to shield her from the world beyond the forest, and she felt their trust like a living pulse against her legs. The rangers stepped forward slowly, their eyes wide with awe, unable to believe what they were witnessing, a human leading wild cubs through the forest in perfect order, and the cubs had followed every step without hesitation, without fear, a bond that seemed almost impossible, yet undeniably real. She knelt slightly, letting the cubs brush against her hands and shoulders, and they leaned into her touch, their soft fur warm and tangible, proof of the trust that had grown in the misty woods over the past hours. And she whispered, "Stay close," one last time, letting the words hang in the morning air as a promise and a farewell. The cubs looked up at her, their small eyes bright and full of recognition, and she smiled softly, knowing that this moment would stay with them even as they entered the station, a moment that had taught them safety, patience, and the meaning of quiet guidance and loyalty. The patrol team and rangers watched in silence as she stood, and the cubs stepped back into line one final time, their formation still precise, before dispersing gently into the care of those who would protect them. And she felt a deep satisfaction knowing that in the heart of the forest something extraordinary had taken place, a bond that transcended fear and distance, a rhythm of trust and courage that would not soon be forgotten. Step by step she had led them through uncertainty, and now the cubs moved forward into safety, their loyalty earned, their trust unbroken, and the memory of their journey would live quietly in the spaces between heartbeats forever. Her hands brushed against ferns and damp moss as she guided the group through the maze of greenery, each small gesture sending a silent signal to the cubs that they were safe to move forward, that nothing would hurt them as long as they stayed close. A sudden snap of a twig echoed through the clearing, and the cubs froze mid-step, their tiny bodies tense and alert. But she did not flinch. She held herself steady and whispered, "Stay close, letting the familiar sound of her voice ripple through the fear, and the cubs exhaled softly and resumed their positions behind her, as if nothing had happened. The sun broke through the canopy in a warm beam, lighting the path ahead, and the cubs stepped into the light following her as though guided by an invisible force that linked their movements to hers, and the patrol team watching from a distance noted the miraculous alignment. The way each cub seemed attuned to her presence, as if she had become their anchor in a world that had been uncertain and frightening. Just moments ago, step by careful step, she led them forward, teaching them patience, teaching them rhythm, teaching them that following did not mean weakness but strength. And as the path stretched onward, the cubs marched quietly behind her, a small, disciplined line bound by trust, instinct, and the gentle authority of the human who had become their guide.